All right, I have the dubious pleasure of talking right after lunch. So I told Adam I was going to say this, but Adam asked me to talk about bugs. He said, "Do you want to talk about bugs?" And I was like, "Sure, I'll talk about bugs." But I'm not an entomologist, so that is my disclaimer. So if you want to know the mechanisms of any of these controls, I can look it up for you. But I'm going to give you a historic overview of vector control efforts as it relates to dengue and primarily Aedes aegypti. And then we can do a bit of a review on some current, because we only got 20 minutes, and then sort of the challenges and strategies for success. And again, this is sort of from an epidemiological standpoint, because again, I'm not an entomologist. But when Adam said he wanted a historic overview, I don't think he figured I'd include a meteor, but here we are. So mosquitoes evolved to be mosquitoes about 150 million years ago. For context, dinosaurs met an unfortunate end about 66 million years ago. My arrow's missing, but if you look up Brahma chickens, this is just for anybody who wants to know, that's proof that chickens are dinosaurs. But Aedes aegypti evolved to be what it is about 7 million years ago. Humans, Homo sapiens, came on the scene about 300 years ago, and then of course we have today. So mosquitoes have been around a very, very long time. We can't talk about historic vector control without talking about historic dengue. So dengue was first mentioned in a Chinese text, and it was called water poison, and it was associated with flying insects. And of course, now we know that that is associated with the aquatic lifestyle and the juvenile breeding sites, which is, water. In the mid to late 1600s, we had a dengue-like disease that was described in the West Indies and Central America. I'm sure we've all heard about the 1780 epidemic in Philadelphia. And so that's just some historical perspective. We're not dealing with a new disease. So, as Dr. Halstead says, 60 years later, well, it's actually about 2,000 years later, right? So Aedes aegypti originated either in Africa or Asia. By 1800, it had spread worldwide, mostly due to increase in global trade and global travel, especially on ships where there was plenty of, breeding sites for the mosquitoes and people and animals to bite and live. After World War II, there was rapid expansion as troops were dispersed all over, and then modern transportation made travel even faster. So, of course, we can't talk about the successes of historic dengue control and vector control without talking about the transient success in Brazil. So in 1923, the Rockefeller Foundation kind of started a yellow fever control program, which focused on breeding reduction, so source reduction, that kind of stuff. By 1929, there was something called the Recife failure, where they had done a lot of aegypti breeding, but one of the technicians had failed to empty the breeding, and the population just rebounded very, very quickly. So at this point, they kind of moved away from yellow fever eradication, decided to target the mosquito in particular. This led to the formation of the Cooperative Yellow Fever Service in Brazil. In this paper by Dr. Soper, I saw Sofer down there, it's not right. Soper, he says in here, which I thought was interesting, we did not plan to eradicate Aedes aegypti. So it was kind of after realizing, I guess, the magnitude of the impact of the vector that they really moved towards a vector eradication to control yellow fever at this time. In 1946, you have the head of the yellow fever program does propose eradication efforts in neighboring countries. And this to me is important because we all know the transboundary nature of infectious disease and vectors. And so you can have discrete success in one geographic or geopolitical area, but that's not necessarily going to be the end of it because, again, mosquitoes know no boundaries. 45 to 55, we have the use of DDT, and this was part of a very big elimination campaign in the Western Hemisphere. And for the time it was used, it was very successful. The question about whether or not DDT was worth it, however, was brought to the forefront with the publication of this Silent Spring book, just kind of raising concerns about the environmental impacts. I'm sure most of you know, but excuse me, there was one of the environmental impacts was its impact on breeding success of eagles, and I think there was an eggshell thinning. By 1972, the EPA in the US canceled the use of DDT for its environmental and health impacts. And then by the 1980s, you started to see the reduction of DDT use in Brazil. It was still used primarily for agricultural and some situational uses, but in 1998, it was in fact banned in Brazil. So if you look at Silent Spring, if you have kids who binge watch Netflix shows like I do, you will wonder, is this the same Silent Spring that they talk about in this Netflix show? It is. I went and looked it up. You're welcome. So this is a famous kind of chart by Dwayne Gubler, and you can see you have the 1930s. This is the distribution of Aedes aegypti. 1930s, it was kind of all over the place. 1970s, with the use of that DDT in particular, they had eradicated Aedes aegypti quite successfully. But once they stopped using DDT, we really did get a rebound in 1998, and then Aedes aegypti decided, you're not the boss of me, and it has not left since. So that's kind of the biggest transient success. There are other successes, we'll talk about them. But most of what we talk about in vector control tends to be chemical control. So early on, like in the 1920s, they would just dump oil or kerosene into the water as a place for, as a larvicide to reduce breeding. Historically, we've had 4 categories of pesticides. Again, for the people who are late, I don't judge you, but I'm not an entomologist. So if you want to know how these work, I will be happy to look it up for you. We start with the organochlorines. These were known for their toxicity. They do have quite high environmental persistence and a bioaccumulation in the food chain. And so this was very unpopular, so we went away from those. Those were used in the 40s to 60s. Then we started with the organophosphates. These had a lower environmental impact, and they were easily hydrolyzed, so that helped with the low environmental persistence. The carbamates had a lot of the same characteristics, easily hydrolyzed, also less environmental persistence. Pyrethroids are by far the one that we're most familiar with. These are high insectidal success, low application rate, so the dose to toxicity ratio is pretty low. They have low mammalian toxicity, which is good, and they have a low environmental persistence. So pyrethroids came on the scene. This is a paper that just shows historical use. Again, this is going through the 4 classes and giving you kind of a timeline. But the interesting thing also from this paper was just looking at the diversity of the types of insecticides, even within classes, that are used across geographies. And so it's very varied, right? And a lot of that is going to depend on regulatory issues, but also population perception, so whether or not humans object. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But yeah, so the use of chemicals has been relatively successful in some ways. So current vector control. So we have immature control, which is things like source reduction, so dumping out water. This is a thing we tell everybody. BTI, which is a bacillus fungus that they put into aquatic breeding sites that will eventually kill emerging adults. Insecticides and pesticides, and then copepods, which are a class of animal that we put into the breeding sites that eats larvae. There are other larvicidal predations, such as, is it Tenerincus? It's a mosquito larvae that eats other larvae. And then you go into adult control, which is insecticides, of course, personal protection, and then some new fancy things like symbionts, GMOs, which we'll talk about soon. However, we still rely heavily on insecticides for population control. This is probably the one we're most familiar with. The problem with that is that we do have, incursion of resistance in the populations. So we have to be careful about how much we spray, how frequent we spray, and we have to be vigilant on surveillance for increasing resistance in our mosquito populations. Here's a look at, these are obviously dengue endemic areas, and this is just showing for each class of insecticide where they have resistance. This is a paper from 2021, I believe. And so you see it's pretty widespread that we're seeing resistance. But we still use it, excuse me. Some of the newer things we have are indoor residual spraying. So this is where you coat the walls and surfaces of domiciles with insecticides. So there's pros and cons to all of these, and this is not a comprehensive list, so I'm happy to talk about others. This targets Aegypti where they rest. So as we all know, the Aegypti ecology is very different from like Culex in that these mosquitoes like to live inside your house. They love to sit under your bed and just wait for you to go to sleep, so they are the boogeyman under the bed. Studies have shown good efficacy with indoor residual spraying, and in some places the infrastructure already exists, so that's really, really good. It is intrusive, so often it requires, this is not something that residents usually do themselves. This is usually a government-led program because, again, there are a lot of regulations on how much you can spray within a certain area. It is workforce intensive. So if you remember the Zika epidemic in Brazil, the indoor fogging and that kind of stuff, it's the same sort of workforce requirements. So the scalability is going to be something that you have to think about, especially in terms of resource limited areas, because it will be expensive in terms of workforce, as well as, pesticides aren't cheap. And then of course you still have the resistance concern because it is a pesticide. Spatial repellents are something they're doing. So if you're from the country south like me, when I first saw spatial repellents, so my grandma used to hang up Ziploc bags of water on her clothesline, and she swore it kept the flies away. And we didn't argue with her, because you don't argue with grandmas. But we were like, okay. Well, I remember I went to Iquitos once, and I walked in, and they had the spatial repellents. I was like, well, I'll be damned. Maybe she's right. And they're like, no, that has pesticide. And I was like, oh, okay. So these are, they kind of look like hanging bags, but they're just little sort of membranes or something that has another sort of pesticide in it. It can also be things like coils and candles. They release chemicals into the air within a given space. This does work on a couple of different ways. It can prevent entry into the house, which will stop contact that way. It can reduce contact because it does irritate the mosquito, so she will be less likely to stand still and probe long enough. She'll just be irritated. It will kill before and after the bites, which will have an effect on reducing transmission, especially within the household. So again, the pros are that it targets Aegypti where they live, which is inside the house. There has been demonstrated success in controlled trials, and there are multiple modes of action for reducing contact. It is intrusive, not as intrusive indoor spraying, because you leave it, and it works for months at a time. It will rely on compliance, so if there is a damage to the coil or the material, then that's going to be something that needs to be reported and replaced. Environmental conditions can affect the efficacy, so if it's too hot, or if something happens within the house that changes some of the stuff, you can have a little bit of a confounding effect there. And then again, a lot of this is still reliant on pesticides, so you have the resistance concerns as well. Wolbachia and other symbionts, of course, these are new and upcoming, not that new, or I'm that old. But we have enhanced motility, decreased fecundity, cytoplasmic incompatibility, which leads to sterile males, and then infection reduction. So there's about 7 million variants of Wolbachia, and each one works a little bit different. These are more natural, so sometimes it can lead to easier marketing with a sort of reluctant public, let's say. There's success stories in Cannes, for example, and Vietnam, they've had successful releases. And they have had the infrastructure for community engagement, and so the infrastructure for acceptance in some of these places is already existing. There can be imperfect maintenance over time. Some of this is due to potential thermal limitations. So in some populations, heat waves can cause a reduction in the maternal maintenance of Wolbachia in emerging adults. But there are other symbionts. This one is the Rosenbergiella, which is a symbiont of Aedes albopictus that they've found in China. They have had success getting it in Aedes aegypti as well. This is hot off the press. This was in Science in 2024 in April. What this does is it acidifies the gut lumen. So when a mosquito takes a blood meal, it's too acidic and the virus actually can't survive. So there are other symbionts other than Wolbachia that are currently up and coming. And then we have sterile male, which can come about through irradiation, or we have the GMOs, so the Oxitec type vector control. There's demonstrated efficacy for what it's used for. There's no lasting environmental issues. I put an asterisk by this because in the Western Hemisphere, we know that Aedes, albopictus, and aegypti are invasive. So if you kill all the aegypti and the albopictus, in theory, the native fauna will come back and fill that niche. In Africa and or Asia, where these are native, we do have to pay attention to what happens when we take this relatively large biomass out of the food chain and out of the ecology to determine whether or not that is a lasting environmental issue. Let's see. The cons are that GMOs are heavily regulated in parts of the world, and they can be very wildly unpopular. So community acceptance might be a challenge. You get pulse results, which I'll kind of show you in a minute. And then it can be, there can be an issue of scalability and affordability, though there has been progress in that recently with the Oxitec-friendly version, which is more community-driven, less workforce-intensive. Of course, you can't talk about success stories in vector control without talking about Singapore. I'm not going to relay that because there's many people in here who are from Singapore who can do a much better job, but this is, of course, one of the success stories of vector control. So what is it from a viral perspective? So there's three essential targets to vector control. There's population control, population suppression, and then behavior control. And this is kind of how these three how most of the vector control modes of action are in a very, very macro way. So population control and behavior modification, I think if we look at this as a sort of epidemic curve, and we look at cases over time, epidemiological impact, I think, of population control can be over the entire period because it's going to be sort of a slow burn into the impact. I think suppression, such as like the pulse control that I was talking about, that has the most impact at, if you're all familiar with the flattening of the curve. It's hard to maintain that in the population, I think, affordably for the entirety of the period, but it does have very good results in flattening that curve, and that can lead to to stress relief on the entire health system, et cetera. So if you like books about mosquitoes, which I'm sure most of you do, because who doesn't, I really did like this quote from this book where it just sort of talks about how mosquitoes don't exist in a vacuum. And this kind of gets into, what I used to call One Health, but I've kind of moved away and called systems thinking, which is we all live in this giant web, and there's so many things that go into what is going to make a control strategy work. So Dr. Halstead talked about piped water. Of course it's important, but I think I argue a little bit that piped water is related to climate change, which is important as well. So you have more drought, you have more water storage, you can have piped water, but if the well one's dry. So it's just, you can do those sorts of connections all day until you're blue in the face. So I think having a systems thinking and adopting this systems thinking in One Health is really going to help us achieve control of dengue, especially from a vector and environmental perspective. So our challenges for success, we have pesticide resistance, constant surveillance to make sure we monitor that. Community acceptance is a big one. Even where we've had vector control in Louisiana for 20-something years, people complain to me all the time, well, the mosquito truck was by my house twice this week. It probably could have gone 3 times, but twice is, that's why you're not getting bit by mosquitoes. Do they really need to come twice? Yes. So people just don't like pesticides, right? And this is sort of the anti-science, the more naturopathic rise of things. We're seeing more and more of this. We can have virus adaptability to other vectors. So I focused on aegypti, but of course we have to remember that albopictus has the same, entered the chat as it will. Changing vector ecology, we have to, again, climate change is going to drive them into new places. That's new places with new people. You're going to have to communicate vector acceptance. In Southern Europe, the GMO restrictions and regulations are going to cause different problems than you do in like California or Florida. And then the transboundary nature of disease and vectors, all of